Professor Ylva Gumede, the head of the Division of Internationalisation and professor in the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so very much for being with us here on SABC News this afternoon.
Thank you.
Prof Gumede, one of the things that was spoken about in that previous clip that you just saw there was, and I just want to go to this because this is really what's on our minds, of course, the issue of us being in a pandemic, COVID-19. And I'd like to talk to, before we talk about press freedom, I'd like to talk to how this pandemic has really sort of affected, how the press do their work, how it's affected journalism, how it has affected reporting. And obviously it has affected it in a negative way. But I wonder if there might have been some positives in terms of reporting that came out of having to deal with such a situation.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing we need to be mindful of, and we just heard UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking to World Press Freedom Day as a whole. And I think that one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted is, of course, the work that we need to do together with internet providers to make sure that we can continue our reporting, but also to push for more transparency from the side of internet providers and a lot of social media platforms as well. So that's one positive thing. But I do think that there's been a lot of reports coming out, and we've seen it in our own context in South Africa, where journalists have been attacked, particularly during the harder lockdown levels, where journalists really needed to be out there to help us understand what the pandemic was doing in our communities. And often, I shouldn't say often, but there were instances where journalists then were prevented from doing their job and even harassed by security forces, police forces, etc. And we've seen that in other contexts on the continent as well. And of course, we know that there are a lot of contexts where journalists on the rest of the continent and in neighboring countries have been attacked as well during their job trying to cover the pandemic. And of course, our job as journalists is extremely important in a crisis situation such as this.
Yeah, we heard President Cyril Ramaphosa applauding journalists, but on the back of that also saying that journalists, reporters must, maintain their credibility. And one of the things that, when we talk about credibility, and it's interesting you speak about social media, for example, if you were to look at, let's give it the example of Twitter, there is some sort of, what's beginning to be a sort of mistrust of some of the reporting. And I wonder what that can be sort of attributed to. I mean, if I look at what is said on Twitter in terms of there is a belief that perhaps some media houses or certain journalists are loyal to certain groupings. And I wonder where all of that sort of came from. I mean, I remember a time where one would report, you'd listen to news reports on the radio, on TV, and you would take it in and believe it, 100%. But now there's a little bit less of that. And I wonder, is it necessarily just a negative thing?
I think that audiences do lose trust. And I think that if we can't do our job properly, particularly around, crisis communication, the pandemic, since we've talked about it, but also in what's mentioned and in the segment just before we started talking about press freedom, we talked about the Zondo Commission, about uncovering corruption in our society, the work that journalists are doing now, covering some of our own commissions, for example. And there is a sense that if we can't have a handle on some of these discussions, they can easily then take their own life on social media, and they often do. And I think that it's very difficult for our audiences to discern what is quality news, what is credible news, vis-a-vis then people spreading hearsay via social media, or trumping up certain aspects of a story, for example. And I've always said this, and I say this, of course, as a journalism lecturer as well, that we have a huge role as journalists in educating our audience about what we do and what could be considered credible news sources, and what we do to make sure that we are credible in the mainstream media.
And I'd like to talk about where we fare, where South Africa kind of ranks globally when it comes to press freedom. I mean, if I look at the fact that many journalists are able to criticize ministers, politicians, presidents, and not really get the kind of backlash that we kind of see in other countries where one wouldn't dare to do such. I mean, from where I'm sitting, I think we're doing quite well. But let's also then, on the back of that, also talk about the new emerging possible threats to the issue of press freedom, particularly pertaining to our country.
Now, I think that what we see, and this is not only in South Africa, but many of our neighboring countries as well, is that we on paper have very high levels of press freedom. Yeah. And of course, press freedom is just one aspect in a broader swath of issues that has to do with freedom of expression. But in actual fact, journalists are often attacked. And we've seen it in later years, particularly a new trend that's really disconcerting, and that is attacks on female journalists, for example. And I think that is something that we need to be wary of. And I do think that what this might not be necessarily all new phenomena, but it's been augmented through social media when news spreads really quickly. And I think that this is a real threat, and we need to take this seriously. The other aspect, of course, is, as you say, as we start using social media and new media platforms to a higher extent, even in our own work as journalists and even as mainstream news media outlets, we also need to be aware of the trippings and fault lines that are there. And we need to work much more closer with our own agencies in South Africa, and with government frameworks and with legal frameworks to ensure that we have the freedom that we have even to report on social media, and that we can remain credible in those social in those spaces as well, and stay within the ambit of what is legal and what is permissible, of course. But I think there's a lot of lobbying we need to do. We need to look at media legislation in our own context again, of course. And as I say, we need to lobby some of the internet providers that we work with for better transparency as well, and we have a function to play in that regard as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry to stay on the issue of social media, but it is quite important, especially now with the rise of information coming from places like Twitter. What responsibility do journalists, reporters, media houses have in terms of correcting certain information? I mean, there's so much information that's there on Twitter, and I wonder if, must one just step back? Sometimes people have decided that something is this, and it's so incorrect, but when you try to correct it, for example, you might even end up being attacked for correcting that thing. I wonder if we have that responsibility where we should be correcting fake news or incorrect information, because at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, Twitter is a huge platform which reaches a huge number of people, and I wonder if we have any responsibility in terms of working together with social media to correct incorrect facts that are put out there.
Yes, of course we have a responsibility. I think it's very difficult. As you say, often when we get involved in these kind of, it becomes a debate and a discussion that can take on its own life. But I do think as journalists we have a responsibility to correct, and we need to make doubly sure, of course, always that we get our facts straight. But if there are things that we need to correct, and we need to go out in the mainstream on social media to correct the facts, we must absolutely do so. I think the danger is that when we as mainstream media or as journalists are drawn in for kind of tit-for-tat kind of discussions on social media, which might then take on a life of its own. I think as long as we stick to the basic facts, we correct it, we make sure that we know what it is that we are putting out on social media and can put a stamp of credibility on that, then we should be fairly safe.
Ylva, it was a great pleasure speaking to you, Prof. Thanks for your time. All right, that is Ylva Gumede, who is with the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg, as we discuss and celebrate World Press Freedom Day. All right, well...